So I first met Stephanie when we began our graduate education together. And I remember looking her work up before I even arrived for my first day of graduate school and thinking that I had some competition ahead of me in that education process, and I was right. So Stephanie has challenged me and still does challenge me to be a better artist, a better thinker, a better teacher, and a better innovator. And she's also become an incredible ally and friend. During our education, I grew to know an innovative maker, a critical thinker, a passionate teacher, and a generous friend. And I rely on her for her honesty, her support, and her forte, organization. So I'm pleased to share her with my students here in the community at Western New Mexico University in Silver City. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome one of the most dynamic makers that I know to the stage, Stephanie Seguin.
Well, thank you all so much for having me, and a major thank you to Courtney for not only inviting me here and helping work out the process of getting me here, but that lovely introduction. I'm a total sap, and I was over there like, I'm about to give a lecture, don't cry. I survived. But I also want to thank not only Courtney, but Stacy for helping put the show together and everything that's going to happen with getting that show installed. I'd love to thank Friends of Clay. I've met a few of you, I haven't met all of you. Thank you for your encouragement and excitement to get me here. I'd like to thank the university for having me here as well. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank the students that I've worked with this past week. It's been a really wonderful experience to get to be a part of the conversations that are happening here and to share with you what I've learned. And I'm really impressed with the student body that is here and some of the ideas that are happening. And it's been a real pleasure to be here. So with that said, I'm going to do just a teeny little bit of repeating to what Courtney said, add a few little things. I'm currently an artist-in-resident at Carbondale Clay Center, where I teach adult classes, community classes, outreach programs, and kids classes. I also am an adjunct faculty member at Colorado Mountain College in Aspen, just up the road from us. I, as Courtney said, did my Bachelor of Fine Arts in Moorhead, Minnesota, which is right up next to North Dakota, Fargo, North Dakota, so that accent comes out every once in a while. You'll have to forgive me. I got my MFA from Penn State, and in between there I had 6 years between the end of my Bachelor of Fine Arts and the beginning of my graduate studies. And as Courtney mentioned, I traveled a lot and I worked a lot. I really tried to utilize that time to not only give myself a little income, but try to use clay as a way to travel and see places and live places I had wanted to. And I was always really aware of this idea that I needed to expand my experience and my background within clay. And so I tried to strategically place myself as best I could to be in new venues and see new avenues of play that I didn't know existed before I was there. So what I thought I would do, partly from working with students this week through studio visits, getting a lot of questions about how I got to where I am, how my work has developed over the years, but also through answering questions of students, I've started to realize that my work that it is today, although it feels very different from what I did 10 years ago, there's a lot of similarities that have come along the way. So I thought I'd take you through a fairly linear timeline of the journey I've had in clay. And I wanted to start, though, with my most recent work, so that you had a little sense of where I'm at now before we kind of go back to where I was. So I decided to start 3 years ago. This is the start of the current body of work as far as I'm concerned. This was one of the first larger installations of my work that I did dealing with the vessel. In this space, I was interested in looking at dynamic lighting and how the viewer could start away from the piece and view it, but then as they walked closer to the piece, there were areas that they could walk into the composition and become a part of the still life of pots. This next image is from my thesis show, where I'm starting to think about not only opening up the space in which viewers could walk through, but also providing areas where viewers could sit down and look at the work. So we see in this photo about half of an 18-foot length table that was custom made for the works that are displayed on it. And not pictured are 4 benches, museum benches that I made, that encouraged and asked people to sit down and view and contemplate the work. My goal with this was to have people walking through the space and really feeling a bodily relationship and connection to the vessels that were on the floor, and then to sit down and be present with the pots. But also one fun thing that started to happen with this work, or with the piece where people sat, is that not only were they looking at the pots, but if they looked just past that, they were looking at the person who was across from them looking at the pots. So there was an interaction with the viewers in the space, as well as the viewers in the work, and then the viewers and the other viewers who were in the space. I also started to, I taught a drawing class for the first time during my graduate studies, and very quickly it kind of sparked some drawings and painting skills that I had not used in a very long time, or interests I should say. And so I started to partner my 2-dimensional paintings, often of the vessel or the pot, with the 3-dimensional vessels. And at this point, the work was sitting separately in my studio. So I didn't make these, the 2-dimensional and the 3-dimensional to go together. I happened to have both of those already, and I thought, how can I display these in a way that creates a connection between the 2-dimensional and the 3-dimensional? So here I've tried to pair pots that have a similar silhouette to those that I've drawn, and place them somewhat strategically. So as the viewer looks at this, they can start to see which pot has pulled from the 2-dimensional and now exists in the 3-dimensional space. Here I have paired some of my vessel drawings with some of the vessels, but not in such a direct way. Decoration is something like decoration of the home, decoration of the space, decoration of the pot is something I've always explored in different ways. And this piece I feel like really starts to bring that home. I can very easily see these in someone's life. But you don't always necessarily see a collage of paintings paired with a collage of vessels. And so it was something I was exploring there. At this time, I also, in the documentation of the work, started to realize there was this additional layer to the work, that when the parts of the vessels and the parts of the canvas came together, they became props of a still life. And then in my mind, the final piece becomes the image of the work. At this point, it's still in the digital. It still exists only in the digital. I have not printed. I have not explored putting this work as a 2-dimensional object into a space. But it's something I kind of keep thinking about and keep bringing from the back of my mind to the foreground. And I'm excited at some point, hopefully sooner than later, to bring those ideas to fruition. I've included this piece because I wanted to express that while clay is my material of choice, it is not something I'm married to or restricted to. I love working with clay because of its long history. That's something I find really beautiful. It may not come through in my work at all times, but I really love that there's this rich lineage of people before me and pots before me and cultures before me. I also love the malleability of clay. It allows me to get whatever shapes I want. It allows me so many opportunities to try new things and mold the clay in different ways. And also, clay becomes a real metaphor. It's strong in metaphor. It's really easy to see the body in clay. Pots themselves have vernacular that relates to the human. They have lips, necks, shoulders, bellies, feet. That's what we have as people, and I'm often interested in thinking about the interactions between people, and then that comes through in the interactions of my pots. But with my love for clay, you'll also notice the backdrop piece of this, the shadow or the behind silhouette. That is actually insulation foam that I've laminated together, cut out to the shape that is the silhouette of the vessel. And then I've color matched a home store paint to my terracotta pot and painted that. So I'm open to whatever material gets the job done. Sometimes I like that juxtaposition that happens between pairing something that you're not entirely, it's not quite right. There's something a little bit wrong with that, but you're not quite sure what until you're told what it is. So with that, I'm going to jump back now that you have some idea of the 3 years leading up to where my current body is. And I'm going to go back to my undergrad studies. I started in 2004, I ended in 2009. It was a 5-year program. Through a good chunk of that, I was working with abstract sculptural work. I have lost those images. I have to dig a little harder to try to find those. So starting here, we're about in my 4th year of my undergrad study, where I was starting to have a respect and an understanding for functional work and starting to explore that idea. But one thing I thought was really interesting, and I pulled these 3 images to show you, is because even working functionally, I was still working in multiples and in repetition. And I don't think I ever made a conscious choice of that. I have the 3 platters that nest, I have the 3 vases that sit together. And then in the upper right piece, we have cake stands, multiple cake stands, and then the cupcakes are real, but the tin foil or the containers that they're in, that is ceramic. Those I have made. I also wanted to bring in this piece. This was called Bound, and it was taking a very simple geometric form and repeating it in different sizes, making it different colors, but combining it as a singular piece. And this is probably the first piece that I ever did where it was taking multiples of the same thing and arranging them and creating a composition with them on the wall. Up until putting this presentation together, I think I've always looked at this piece as just something that's in my archive. I've never really put 2 and 2 together, although it seems very obvious right now, that this is my first attempt at arranging components and creating a still life that exists in this 3-dimensional space. And then here I have some more objects. I was talking with someone earlier about these urchins, and there was a little sculptural bit to that, but this idea that even in the singular form, I wanted many of them. And quite honestly, at this time, I was interested in what the mass quantity looked like. I wasn't as narrowed in and focused at what the individual object looked like that made up that entire object. That was something when I left undergrad I tried to pay a lot of attention to, is if I take a singular piece from this, is this piece as special as the big piece? And I think in my undergrad, because that attention wasn't paid to the individual object, I didn't always hit that mark. But with these vases that I have, what I thought was interesting is I was thinking about how things might be displayed in a gallery setting versus a home setting. And with the gallery, with the wall piece, I was feeling more like a more clean-cut, contemporary approach to how you might display a bouquet of flowers if they've been broken up and they're minimally arranged. Whereas in the home, they become a cluster, and the idea with these elevated earthenware stands was that you could put them on your table space and they would create this this up and down on your space. One thing I've noticed when I was putting this together, that as well back at this point, unconscious or subconsciously, I was making work that although I suggested the way I want it arranged, I was not committing whoever would take these objects and put them in their home. I was not committing them to that arrangement. None of these were set. It would be very easy for someone to choose to display the arrangements in different ways. I was just giving a suggestion through the way I displayed it. I also worked with the multiple of a singular object. So on the left here I have about 300 2x2-inch square tiles, which were all bound together with a copper wire. Initially I had planned this to be a room divider, a curtain that divided the space. As I was making them, they very much so started to feel like armor or cladding that was protecting something. And so I made the choice, as I was getting close to installing this work, to clad or protect or armor a movable gallery wall. The piece on the right, I consider these little drops of clay, which were made from a really wet, soft clay that I just plopped out and let dry as they will. I consider them pebbles they kind of looked like a pebble to me. And so I started taking them out into the community I was living in at the time and arranging them in different ways that was influenced and informed by the places I was arranging them. So on this bike path, I started to think about, why are people on a bike path? They're taking a journey, they're walking the length of something. And so I wanted my pebbles to walk that length as well. This is my thesis show for my BFA, and it was a 5-person show. I was very grateful to my 4 other partners in the show, as they let me interact with the audience through the fact that we served no plates at our reception for our food. Instead, viewers were asked to come into the gallery and take a plate from the piece I was calling Suspended Cupboard. And so each of those plates were hung with an earring hook, hung upside down, so that they could come in, pick a plate that they wanted to use, unhook it, go out, get their food, and come back into the gallery. And then dessert was served with the cupcakes. And this was the first time, although I was interested in the arrangement, this is the first time I was really intrigued and wanting to address the audience who was viewing my work. I wanted them to become a part of the work that I was presenting. So if we're looking at how I got from the circles to the work that led me to the work I am today, I know we're jumping timelines just a little bit here. I'm going to get to that, but first I want to go back all the way to where I grew up, because I think there's some interesting things that happened there. I'm technically from Hudson, Wisconsin, which is on the border of Wisconsin and Minnesota. We were 15 minutes from the Twin Cities and an hour and a half from anything of large size in Wisconsin. So although I'm from Wisconsin, I consider myself from Minnesota because of the time I spent. However, I had the city and the culture and the nightlife and all that the city offered, the bustling people right there. 10 miles away from Hudson was where my dad lived in River Falls, Wisconsin, which is home to the Kinnickinnick State Park. And so I had these dual kind of experiences growing up. I would be in the cities often, but I could also retreat to nature, right? And I could learn to appreciate the difference that those two offered. Another thing that I think is pretty pinnacle for me is that my parents divorced when I was very young, and although them divorcing was not anything all that extraordinary, what was amazing to me in looking back is that I was given the opportunity to see 2 perspectives growing up. And while most of us have 2 parents and they have their own perspectives, often they're in alignment. My parents were not always in alignment. And that was a wonderful experience for me that I think everyone goes through in their life, where they realize their opinions and their ideas and their backgrounds are not the same as everyone else's. But at a young age, I was able to see that 2 people I really cared about and had a huge influence on me. I saw that there were 2 very different points of view. And I bring that up as well as the 2 locations that I grew up in, because I really feel that that idea of perspective and seeing through different lenses is something that still informs and influences the work that I'm making today. Okay, so I'm going to jump forward. Once I finished my undergrad program in 2009, I took an apprenticeship in Whitefish, Montana. This is an image from Glacier National Park. And the apprenticeship was at a production facility. This is the gallery space that the studio had. The production studio was a strictly business-oriented production studio. Everything was handmade, but everything was predetermined. There were very strict sizes, weights, colors, patterns that we had to use. And while this fit into my love of repetition, I also found it a little lackluster, and I found that while I thought having a business in clay was something I really wanted, I needed to find a different approach to that. It was a little too everyday monotonous for me. But a major thing that happened at the end of my apprenticeship is there was a capstone solo show. So this is my first solo show that I ever did, and I was very excited for the opportunity to start to fill the space. And so what I did is I have over 200 slab plates. The gallery extends on either side of this image that you can't see. And the idea was that you have a functional wallpaper that is decorative when not in use. You can go unhook them from the wall when you want to use them, hook them back up when you're done. So a continuation almost of the suspended cupboard. I've been talking to some of the students about networking and the potential that that has. While I was at Whitefish Pottery, I met someone who had worked down in a production studio and teaching facility on St. John in the Virgin Islands, and she knew that they were looking for somebody, and she thought I would be a good fit for that. So she recommended me for the position. I applied for it, and I got it, and so I was able to move to St. John, which I could not complain about. So there I worked for a woman named Gail. She's in the red apron in the corner. She's a wonderful human being and operated and owned a studio that was production, but it also catered to the local community. They were able to come and have studio access there, take classes there. And then because St. John is a tourist destination, we also offered tourist classes, where it was like an activity where people could come and take classes with their families. And so that was my first introduction to working outside of academia, but in a community space. And also it gave me a lot of teaching experience, because during the high season I was teaching up to 6 wheel throwing classes a night. Prior to that, I had not done much wheel throwing, so I used that time, my time on St. John, to really hone in on my throwing skills. I am going to include real quick, the photo on the right I included because Gail, while I was there, she was awarded a bid and a grant to do some replication for the national park that's located there, and I got to assist her with that. And so we were replicating ancient tiny no pottery, which meant that we were digging up local clays and testing them and matching them to the pots that we were referencing in the archaeologist's lab, and we were able to do different pit firings, find the different tools around the island that they might have used, and replicate these historic works. So it was a pretty fantastic experience. But I mentioned that I used this time to throw. Pretty much what I did is clay was really expensive on St. John, and the firings were expensive, and I was living on a bit of a budget. And so what I would do is I would throw all the work that I want, throwing on the pottery wheel, for those of you who aren't familiar. So I would make work on the pottery wheel, and I would look at it, I'd take notes, I'd decide what I did and didn't like, and then I would break it all, and I'd resaturate it, rework the clay so that I was able to reuse it, and I'd make that same thing again. And then I would learn from it and take some photos, take some notes, and repeat the cycle. And so I think for the entire year I was living there, I only used 150 pounds of clay, which nowadays I go through that every couple of weeks. So it was a pretty great experience in learning how to hone in my skills. There's another piece that I made from there. At the end of my year contract, I decided I missed the mountains, and so I moved back to Montana. And at that point, I settled myself just a little bit. I felt like I'm going to stay here for a few years. I built a garden. We had a flower garden, we had a vegetable garden, and I also had friends who were working at a greenhouse. And so my life was kind of filled with this life and this organic matter. And very quickly that started to come into the work I was making, both through the forms that I was making in order to display floral arrangements, but also the works that were not for the floral work, they had floral patterns on them. And you'll also notice I've started to merge white clay and red clay together using different materials through the same process. Some more examples of that same body of work. And I'm also, I look back on this and I see the display is still a factor for me. I'm still thinking about how people are going to interact with the work and view the work. This plate set, the idea is that when you're using it, you unpack them all, and when you're done using them, you can put it on whatever shelf is on display, and you can have those seen as a decorative object when not in use. So this is the work that I applied to my graduate work with, and I was in an interesting position. I was accepted to graduate school, but I didn't get an assistantship, and an assistantship meant I had to pay for graduates, or not having an assistantship meant I had to pay. And I made a choice that I was not going to pay for that. So I removed my name from the pool and decided to apply to their post-bac program, and I was accepted with that. And very quickly, being back in academia and being around some very powerful influences and voices and questioners, things got really weird. And I started to think, okay, I love the garden, I gotta push that further. What are these organic references I'm looking at and thinking about? And so I wanted to include this for a couple of reasons. One, it's, I think, a great source of direct influence and inspiration, but also things are not always good, you know, and you can still work through them and learn a lot from them. And I would say what I learned the most from these is I kind of honed in on some of my building skills. This is where I started to use the coil, which for those of you who have been in the classes, it's nonstop coil talk. But it's also where I started to make vessels. I was making vases. And so then I kind of got some of the weirdness out of there. I was still making vases and different vessels. And I started to feel like it was a lot to think about, having to think about the form and the surface. What kind of slip do I want to use? What kind of glaze? What kind of pattern? What kind of design? It was a lot. And so I made the choice to get rid of all of surface and just focus in on the form. And so this is the first attempt at making many forms, and it's really the start of my study on forms. And then I got a little form obsessed, and I started to think, how many different ways can I make a form? I had a studio mate who was a little obsessed with the laser, not Courtney, but one of our friends, and the laser cutter. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try that laser cutter. So I was cutting out the negative space, I was cutting out the silhouette, the line. The forms were in clay, they were in wood, they were in plexiglass, they were in fabric, they were all over the place. And I kind of took over the studio with all of my different forms. At this point, the images you're seeing, I'm in grad school now. So I reapplied to the same program and was fortunate enough to get accepted with an assistantship, so I was able to continue my studies there and continue my obsession with the form. So I had all these parts. I had this mass quantity of forms that lived in my studio. I had terracotta forms, which are the red ones. I had forms covered in white slip, which are the white ones. I had the insulation foam, which are covered in the terracotta pots. Those are the middle bottom section there. If you see in the top middle section, there's this white kind of fold. That's fabric. I was wrapping my pots in fabric. I was just trying any and everything, getting as experimental as I could. And then once the form started to come into play, or started to feel like, okay, I'm getting somewhere with this now, what do I do with all of these? Then I went back to display and arrangement and got very experimental with that as well. I do have to point out, I noticed in rehearsing this that we have some Courtney Michaud in the backdrop here. It was a joint show that we were in as graduate students. So I've taken the silhouette, I've taken the line, I've taken the voluminous form, and I've started to pair them all together, and I'm getting back to this idea of thinking of how do people move through space, how do they interact with my work. And then I became obsessed with how many different ways I could install that work. And again, thinking of the work as parts, this is kind of where that idea started. Like, I have all these parts, I made this installation, now what? How can I rearrange this? How can I re-show this? What new materials can I bring in? And as I was doing that, I started to think about shadow, and then the shadow became a painted part of the pot or a painted part of the pedestal that it was on. And there I started to think about the relationship between the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional. Now we're entering kind of my last year of my graduate studies, where I am very literally pairing the canvas with the terracotta. Here I have on the canvas, it is stretched canvas that I stretched, but instead of using a gesso primer or something traditional in a painting method, I used house paint and I rolled it on with a roller. And then I had masking tape and charcoal that did a rubbing on that. And I paired it with the pot. And again, the document, like this exists only in documentation. It was never shown this way. But I quite enjoy the composition as a digital image. This is a crop shot from 2 slides ago when I showed you that, or a couple slides ago, where there was that kind of wild arrangement with Courtney's lovely, soft, quiet pieces in the back. When the photographer who was taking documentation work for me was doing that, he asked if I wanted any close-up shots, and I liked this area that had a little shadow in the backdrop, and he took an amazing image. I don't think I ever would have been this smart to take this image, but this got me so excited about the potential of the image becoming the final work. part of the reason I haven't actualized this idea and it still lives in digital form is because I have not taken that much photography lessons to really know how to do this right. So instead of hacking it, I'm gonna leave it live there for now. So at this point, the same way that the surface started to feel like too much information to process, all of these different arrangements I was doing started to feel like a lot to process. And so I started to pare down the amount of pieces that I was arranging and pairing together. So I have some quieter compositions here. Still interested in bringing in the two-dimensional work that I was doing, and also partnering some of my influences with this. In the upper right-hand corner of the painting is a photocopy image of a Morandi piece, who I think a lot of our artists look to and are inspired by and admire. And that is certainly no exception for me. I think he's a big influence in the work I do. I also started to think about, instead of having the different colors of the red clay, what the work would do if it became a monochromatic palette. And I was looking at different ways to show volume. So with the two-dimensional image, we have volume through contour drawing. And then we have the physical realm of that volume existing in the vessel. One thing I thought was interesting with this pairing is the kind of background of the canvas is the white, and the terracotta becomes the surface. The terracotta colored paint becomes the surface. Whereas with the pot, the vessel, it's a terracotta vessel and then is surfaced with a white glaze. So there's this play between the foreground and the background. And then, Liz, I mentioned we would see some halved pots. Here they are. So this is a quite literal representation of how can I pull the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional together. I was using molds, press molds, to mold half of the form that I made, and then applying that surface to a flat slab, and looking at different ways in which those could be finished. And so the finish that's on those, the surface, is a very thinned out house paint that I've dipped the terracotta piece into. And I really enjoy with this piece that kind of soft, translucent push-pull between what's the underneath and what's the surface layer. And then that work led me to a piece you've seen already. This is my thesis show. This is the work that was kind of the capstone for my graduate studies. Courtney and I were talking the other day about how in the moment it felt like a really big deal, and it felt like this is it, this is what our work is now. And like 2 weeks after the show was down, it's like, no, there's so much more to figure out. So the thesis show is kind of this funny term, right? It's the thesis of what you've done, but it's really just the beginning for what's next. I left my time at graduate school to move to Carbondale, Colorado, where I am currently. I've been there a year. I mentioned in my intro that I work with kids as well as adults. We do outreach programs. This is going to be my little plug for my Carbondale Clay Center. With all the teaching we do, we also host national gallery shows, which rotate monthly. We have a retail store that sells local and national clay artists. So we're trying to be this hot spot for the clay community in Colorado, but also on the national scene. One of the perks of me being a resident is that I have the opportunity to show there once a year. So in July, I had my resident show, and I've included a couple of images from that. And some of this work you will see at the McCray Gallery when that opens up. Some of it will be shown in a slightly different way. So this piece is called Nuanced. I should mention, when I started my residency, because I had that intense experience of graduate school, I really felt totally burnt out on the vessel and on the arrangement, and I thought, am I doing this because this is what I'm supposed to be doing, or am I doing this because I trusted and admired my faculty who helped me get to that direction? And so for the first 6 months really of my residency, I kind of went off in totally different directions. I revisited things that I had put on the back burner 3 years before. I decided I need some new plates, I'm going to make some plates. I haven't done a soda firing in a while, and this local potter is going to do one. I'm going to make some work for that. And I really just tried to get rid of everything that I had done and very quickly realized that I was supposed to be doing what I had done in grad school. And so with this show, The Vessel has come back, and I'm starting to think about the arrangement and display, the two-dimensional and three-dimensional still, but I'm trying to do it in a much more intimate scale. Work that you can view as a singular object versus as an entire space that you're working within. I also felt like in grad school I was in a pretty limited color palette, and I was pretty desperate to get some color in there. So I brought in some magentas and hot pinks and all sorts of stuff, as well as continuing with the earthenware and the white Maiolica glaze carried over. I have felt under the piece there. That's what that texture is. It's wood with felt on it. This is a piece that will be shown in the McCray Gallery as well, with a slight variation to it. With this piece, it's called Echodependence. I was really thinking about the relationships that pots have, the relationships that people have, how we might imitate or depend on one another. And these pots, to me, while they can exist on their own, seem to do a little bit more when they're paired together. A small little study with porcelain, wood, and felt. And then this, I've been kind of considering individual three-dimensional paintings that are partnered together on the wall. There will be a variation of this in the McCray Gallery, although none of them will be of small little compositions. Here we have a couple singular, a partner, and then two with the three pots together. I've also, with this piece that you won't see in the McCray Gallery, incorporated felt onto the wall. And then this is the slide I'm going to end you with. This is titled Shifting Balance. One thing I've been really aware of in making this work and then viewing this work after the fact is that although I thought a long time ago I was departing the home when I stopped making functional or utilitarian-based functional wear that was meant to be used every day, this still very much so reads the home to me. It feels like it could be displayed in an interior design. It feels like interior design is a huge influence on this to me. And additionally, with the materials I'm using, I'm going to the home goods store to, or not Home Goods, the brand, but a store that you can, a home improvement, I should say, home improvement store. I'm getting wood from there, paint from there, felt, etc. It still feels very much so tied to the home for me. And while I don't necessarily have a clear grasp or understanding on what that means, that's one direction I'm looking to with my work in the future, is to explore that further. So with that, thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
What do you believe is the most interesting, I can't think of what I was going to say, I just lost it. The most interesting thing that, or inspiration that you've gotten to make one of your art pieces?
That's a great question. I don't know if there's necessarily one thing that has inspired an art piece, like a singular piece, that is the most exciting to me. But I would say this idea of perception is definitely something that is super motivating me. It drives my curiosity. One, how the work can be seen, but how the pots can start to influence what you're seeing and how you're seeing them. So that's something that's coming up over and over again through many of my displays or pieces. Yeah.
How were you inspired to do things? Like, how did it all start?
Yeah, so for me it started in high school, and I was a terrible student, absolutely awful, barely made it through. Quite literally, I had to take a class that was designed to get those who weren't going to graduate through at the last minute. School was not my thing at that point, but one area I excelled in was in art, and I think a lot of that is because I'm a fairly stubborn person and I didn't like being told what to do. But in the art room, I was able to be a little bit more expressive and put some self-interest into what I was doing. In our high school, you had to take all of the two-dimensional classes before you could get through to the three-dimensional classes. And even once you were in the 3D classes, you had to take sculpture before you could take clay. So I'm not quite sure if I always had an interest in clay or if there was something about like I want to get to that place that they're telling me I can't be until I do all these things. But I powered through all of my two-dimensional work, the sculpture, and then just hung out in the clay studio for the rest of my high school career. And then going to college, the only thing that made sense was to continue in the arts. So I enrolled in art education. Very quickly realized that while I love teaching, I was interested in being a studio artist, and so I switched majors there. But I have to say, once I got to college, I was an amazing student. So I don't want you to think I'm a bad influence on your students. I did very well in college. Yeah, that was.
Oh, yeah. So you've been doing this earthenware with the forms, hand-built coils, your flattened coils, and so forth for 3 years. Could you talk about where you think you're going to take that next step? Where you think that's going, or if you came back next year, are you going to be doing total sculptures or fussy Maiolo?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this work feels very genuine at this point, and it feels like something I can continue to explore for quite a while. I think most likely the direction I'll go next is one thing I've started to do. Almost everything you saw in this this lecture, this slideshow, they're vessels. They open up, they expand. They have a way into the form. I've been really interested in starting to make closed forms that are still, they start out as a vessel, they start out as a form very similar to the vessel, but at some point I decide I want to close that and contain what's inside. So I think that's probably a place I'll go next. I'm really interested, I've had a huge background and huge skill kind of building experience and time with clay as a material. I'm really interested to learn a lot more than I do now about paint as a material, wood as a material. So I think the vessel will stick around and the way I've been building, but what might change is how that work is being displayed based on the information I kind of pick up as I explore that. Yeah.
In regards to your sales, how do you think of your work as a piece with the entire installation, or things that can be sold singularly?
Yeah, so some of them, it depends on the piece. For example, in the McCray Gallery, the show that you'll see Finding Form, there will be some pieces that are sold kind of as a set. And those, I think, will be fairly clear through the display which ones are meant to go together as a whole. Some are sold as like a little display shelf, very similar like to this one, where it's sold as a set there. But then the large installation of vessels that is comprised of, I think the total is 108 vessels. Those are seen as a singular piece but sold individually. And that's, for me, that's the sake of wanting to make my work accessible to people. I'm a fairly prolific maker, and so I'm always kind of curious of what's the next form. So I don't feel entirely committed to keeping all of my work together. I feel like it's very easy for me to move work out of the installations and move work in as I continue to use them as parts and re-show them. And two, I mean, at some point, like if we look back to some of those first vessels I was making, what I've learned in the craftsmanship and the skill and the technical component of making them, I feel like I've advanced so much. And so as that happens, I'm also interested in, as the work kind of progresses, moving out the older work. Yes?
Kind of a two-part question.
Uh-huh.
I'd like to know a little bit about who are your influences that you really honor. You're in the area where Solder was.
Mm-hmm.
You came from where Mackenzie and Glenn Nelson,
Yeah.
that crowd, and then the converse is, who don't you like?
So who do I honor? For me, in clay, Betty Woodman is someone that I continuously look at. I feel like my work is so inspired by the work that she has done. Certainly Lucy Ree with the vessel work that she was doing. A contemporary artist, Mark Ferris, is someone who I really admire as a vessel maker. There are many people that I have looked at and been influenced by over the years, but I do find that while I look at what's happening in the clay world, and when I look at what has happened and really try to pay a lot of attention to the history and the importance of that history to clay, I also try to look outside of my main medium. And so I'm often looking at sculpture artists or painting artists, so Morandi, for example. I also really love Eva Hess. Helen Frankenthaler. Although some of my work doesn't really, it's not reflective of any of that, I'm really inspired by the ideas that they were, philosophies that they were working with. People I don't like. I guess there's no one that's like really grinding at me. So that's good. I tend to be someone who can, I joked to one of Courtney's intro classes that my students can find me a bit of a pushover because I can take someone's spin of something. I'm like, okay, I don't agree, but I can see that point of view. I think that probably goes for people whose work I don't like, or I don't like their approach. I think I can usually say, it's not for me, but it's for you. Yeah. Yes?
What part of the clay process do you like the most? Is it firing, or is it the raw material, or what is it?
It's definitely the making for me. It's the physicality and the labor of the repetition that I'm doing. So all of my work is coil built, which means I'm taking up a ball of clay and I'm rolling it into a very long string of clay, essentially. And then I'm attaching it and shaping it and molding it into the form that I want it to be. And that tends to be a very time-consuming process. And also, as the students have learned, there's a lot of drying time realities with that. And so instead of making one piece at a time, I'm often making anywhere up to 20 pieces at a time. And so there becomes this repetition that happens and this kind of active labor that becomes really enjoyable to me. Every once in a while I have to kind of step back from that, and that's, I think, when I start drawing. It's a very different process. But definitely the making, the physicality of that. The idea generating is something I really love as well. I get so inspired by thinking through potential ideas and trying to figure out how that could work and how I could accomplish that. It's a really exciting part of the process for me.
What are your other hobbies besides?
So I like this summer has been insane. I don't really have time for hobbies right now. And two, I'm at a point in my career where I can't support myself fully with my studio work. So my studio work often fills the time frame where a hobby might fit otherwise. But I love to hike. I love to be on rivers doing some rafting. I like reading. I like my dog a lot. I like to veg out like anyone does. I have a hard time sitting still though, so hiking's a great fit for that if I had time to do it.
What kind of dog do you have?
He is a lab boxer pit bull mix, and he is the cutest dog you've ever seen. Maybe second to Hank, Courtney would say. Yeah.
I just had a question. I love your path forms. Those are so beautiful. They just
Yeah.
make really cool, funky shapes. But you mentioned the paint is house paint that's diluted. I'm just wondering, it's a funny technical question, but
Yeah.
how did it adhere? Did you have to do something else?
No, I didn't. So because I'm working with an earthenware form or earthenware clay, terracotta clay, that clay never truly vitrifies. It's always porous, no matter how hot you get it. And so what it does is it's still absorbent. And so when I dipped it in that thinned out paint, it dried almost instantly, and it adheres very well. It's only been 3 years since that has been done, so we'll see how it holds up. But at this point, it still looks the same. Yeah.
You treat your gallery space as an installation space, so you just don't go in there and flop your pots down, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how do you go about mapping out that installation space for flow, surprise,
Yeah.
discovery, and how much control do you have on it? Are you adjusting the lights, setting all that up?
Yeah, so as an undergrad, I was able to be a part of I did a work study and I was able to be an installation crew member of the gallery space. And so that early education of thinking about space and lighting other people's work and thinking about the curation of the space and the curator's role, the gallery director was very hands-on with us about sharing readings on museum studies, and so I think that has had a huge factor. I think I've always been interested in space as well, and this idea of me wanting the viewer to interact with the piece, well then the physicality and proximity has to be considered, and so that's where I start to think about how to move through a space. Up until this very show, I have always been able to install the work myself, and so it becomes a part where, or it becomes a bit of the work is halfway done when I bring it into the gallery, and then I finish in the space, and there's a lot of intuitiveness happening. I'm standing back, I'm looking critically, I'm coming back up to it, I'm making subtle shifts, and that includes the lighting, really thinking about how viewers move through the space, how they move around the work, paying attention to some realities of what people feel comfortable with and what they feel uncomfortable with, and depending on the piece I'm showing, do I want to enhance that discomfort, or do I want to take away that discomfort so that people can get right up close to it. For planning for this show, where I'm going to be leaving the work, and students and Stacy and Courtney will be helping to install that show, because so much of my process is in the arrangement itself, I really had to think about how can I plan to provide the correct prompts for those who will be installing it. And so on a very technical level, I made a diagram of the gallery and I did it to scale, so then I figured out what the sizes of my pieces were, and I got very close to having a fairly specific installment of the work. But there will be a few areas that the students will be able to use their discretion. I had a meeting with them and we kind of talked about what some of my thoughts are and processes, things that I am thinking about when I'm installing the work, what I would like to leave open to them, what I would like them to refer back to and kind of use my discretion with. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to see how that is, because I don't anticipate always being there to install my work, and quite honestly, I don't know if I will want to always be the one to drive, however far or fly or whatever, ideally, depending on where my work is shown, to install it. So I'm excited for the opportunity to see what happens, to see what works well, and hear back from the students on what was easy for them, what was a challenge for them, and then also to see the results and see what I'm happy with and what I would have done differently, and then use that to inform my future directions. All right, I think that might be it. Thank you, everyone.